Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be taking a slightly closer look at the essay My Generation by F. Scott Fitzgerald. There's no way we could get into absolutely everything about this essay. We would be here forever, and I'm going to try to keep it to about 15 minutes or less for you. So my goal is not so much for this video to explain every last piece of writing in this essay, but more just to point out some key themes to keep in mind for your writing assignment, and then also to show you ways that I look at a piece of writing to kind of help you with your own reading process. So to start, why are we reading this essay? I've said this already, but just as a reminder, other than the fact that it's a great essay, it was the inspiration for the title of The Great Believers, which is the book that we'll be reading a lot of. There's a lot of implicit connections. I think the biggest one being kind of the wars that are fought by the main characters or people in either one. In this essay, we see a lot about wartime, whereas in The Great Believers, we see a lot about the AIDS epidemic. And that in both pieces of writing, we get something that spans most of the course of a generation's life. In The Great Believers, we have multiple timelines, so it really covers a long period of time in our main characters' lives. And in this essay, F. Scott Fitzgerald is able to reflect with hindsight on a long period of his own life. A little bit of context for this essay. This essay was actually Fitzgerald's attempt to distance himself from the jazz generation. You may know him as the writer of The Great Gatsby, and that's how everybody knew him, and kind of had this sense that he was really trying to profit off of the jazz generation, that he was just kind of this one-note writer that, if you've read The Great Gatsby, you know that it is really actually an indictment of the jazz generation, but a lot of people over time have tried to take it as something that glamorizes it or romanticizes it. So he was really attempting to be taken more seriously here, and so really the whole point of this essay is for him to show that he wasn't just a member of the jazz generation who was trying to profit off of it, but somebody who had been through all these other things and was trying to warn about the possible dangers that he saw this next generation engaging in. A couple of major themes or trends. Again, we can't get into absolutely everything, so I think it helps to kind of think about major themes so that we can narrow down what's important to us and filter out what maybe isn't as important. So of course these are somewhat subjective, but these are the main things that I see to be key to this essay. And the first one is things that should be nice or pleasing, either aesthetically or emotionally, but they aren't for one reason or another. We'll get an example of that right away, so it'll make sense soon if it doesn't to you yet. Another major trend we see is lack of control over major life-changing events. This one is also really key to keep in mind as we read The Great Believers. And then also the use of hindsight. This is not a piece written by somebody living through the era that they're describing. It's somebody who has lived through these periods of time, looking back and reflecting with that hindsight. These are all things that are important to keep in mind. If you've looked ahead, you've seen that your first writing assignment is going to be writing your own version of this for your own generation. So these are a couple of important things to keep in mind. So with that, we're going to take a look together at my own annotated copy of this. Again, if you did not highlight something I had, that's totally fine. Like all good literature, there's a lot to take out of this, and there's a lot that can mean different things to different people. My goal here is not to dictate what you should have gotten out of this, but more just to show you how I approach a piece, right? Especially on an online class, for some of us, that's a totally new skill. So here you can see I made my own copy of the Google Doc. I highlighted words or phrases that stood out to me. I left little comments in the corner. If you're not sure how to do that, you just select the word you want. Then this will show up. You can click add comment, and you can type in whatever it is that interests you. So first one right away is the subtitle here. We usually use the word subtitle in terms of translation, like you have subtitles on your TV. I know I used to live under the flight path, so we had those just to hear what was going on. But in this case, it can mean just, it's not quite the title, but it's meant to be a significant part of the work. And so this one here, I think, is a great example of that first trend that we talked about, things that should be nice but aren't, where it says the most beautiful thing in the world was a football captain killed in battle. So we have beautiful, right? So that already sets up a certain expectation for us. And then we have football captain, which of course has all these connotations in American culture of somebody who's beloved and really successful. But then we have kind of the shift in tone about how they were killed in battle. And this is really a great subtitle because, like I wrote down in my comment while reading, it's pretty much a perfect one-line synopsis of what America was like at this time Fitzgerald was growing up in. You know, even people that were the most popular, most successful, well-liked people in an area could have just lost their lives in the wars that he was fighting in his time. So that can be something else that you can keep in mind of what would the equivalent be like for your generation while you're doing your own writing. We have a lot of also good descriptions here, the things that I have in green, mewling and burping, things that make them seem almost animalistic. And then also this one part, we were unaware of being the great inheritors, unaware that as we took over the remnants of the crumbled Spanish Empire, the robe of primacy was being wrapped around our little shoulders. So we have this repetition of the word unaware. Again, the idea that there are factors in motion that are beyond their control, things that really are going to dictate the course of their lives that they have no power over. And then, of course, I highlighted this one, we were the great believers. Like I mentioned, that's where the title comes from. So again, this idea of a generation born with hope. A couple other lines I highlighted towards the top of page 2. It says, it is important just when a generation first sees the light. And by a generation, I mean that reaction against the fathers which seems to occur about 3 times in a century. So this is even just a very interesting definition of the term generation. If you're not really sure how to respond when I say to write something about your generation, here he's positing that the idea of a generation is just whenever there's a group that's different enough to, like he says, react against their fathers, right? Or react against the people who are older than them. Here, I highlighted a strongly individual generation sprouts most readily from a time of stress and emergency. Tensity communicated from parent to child seems to leave a pattern on the heart. So as you read this, you'll find a lot of things that are, like he says, times of stress and emergency. Those are the things that seem to shape people, bond them, stick in their memory, help them place themselves in time. Not saying that your written pieces need to be all dark and serious, but in this case, Fitzgerald's is. Okay. And then I highlighted this last line because he's still kind of incorporating this humor. He says, in haste, let me add that my generation is very much alive. One of us recently married Hedy Lamarr, which, if you don't know, she was an Austrian-American actress. She was married 6 times in 30 years. So here we get this kind of reminder from him that although this is a retrospective piece, it's not that everybody has died. In this second section, we get a lot about these different 2 worlds that he has lived in, even in the same lifetime. This idea of being in a pre-war America and a post-war America, and the contrast between the hope that people had and then just the intense loss that happened afterwards. We see that here. The fact gives my generation its uniqueness. We were at once pre-war and post-war. So again, trying to narrow down who he feels a part of, right? It's not just people that had no concept of the World War, but it's also not people who only ever lived in it. And I think he really drives this point home in this line here that's really eerie to me, where it says, men of our age in Europe simply do not exist. I have looked for them often, but they are 25 years dead. So also just acknowledging that his generation is greatly thinned out from the war. He's one of the lucky ones that survived, and there just aren't his counterparts in Europe. I know you haven't read The Great Believers yet, or maybe you haven't, probably haven't. But this is a great connection to one of the characters, Fiona, that we'll read a lot about too. He kind of adds on to this when he says, "So we inherited two worlds, the one of hope to which we had been bred, the one of disillusion which we had discovered early for ourselves." Right? And then he ends that paragraph saying, "I do not accept that world, as for instance my daughter does, but I function in it with familiarity, and to growing extent my generation is beginning to run it." So again, this idea of inheriting something that he doesn't want, right? He flat out says he does not accept it, but they really are inheriting it, right? The same way that you might inherit a shop from a family member or something. He says that they are starting to run that world that they didn't ask for. Part 3 is a lot about returning from the war, the after effects of the war, handling death. Right? He mentions here, forget quickly, as kind of his advice almost to others and to himself. There's a lot of people he mentions here. The references might not all resonate with you, like Tom Wolfe, Irving, Poe. We have a lot of writers here. We have a lot of people who have kind of tragic ends or tragic lives. And then here he kind of sums it up. All in all, it was a husky generation. So this idea of survival as champions. And then we get another football reference here, where he's talking about somebody he came in contact with, but it says, "But I remember him best when he was center and I was quarterback on the second team at school. We were both 15 and awful. And Hope gave me no protection at all, and I would have paid well for protection. We were the laziest and lowest ranking boys in school. In college, I was luckier." So again, this idea of the randomness of things, people beyond their control saying that they were the laziest and lowest ranking, but as far as he knows, they were people that survived the war. So this concept that it wasn't, the morality picture that a lot of people painted it out to be. In this 4th section, we have a lot about the recap of this generation's unique challenges and why he feels attached to them. This is really key to him trying to distance himself from one generation and reclaim another. He refers to his generation as people who have one foot planted before the war and one after it, as well as a generation where their capacity to believe has run very thin. And then towards the end here, we get a paragraph that I think is just a beautiful ending, where he says, "But I have never cared for any men as much as for these who felt the first springs when I did, and saw death ahead and were reprieved, and who now walk the long stormy summer." I think that's great because the seasons, we talk about seasons and seasons of life a lot, and he uses that metaphor here, talking about how they felt the first springs that he did, right? Born around the same time, saw death ahead, were in the war together, were reprieved, they were spared from death, but now they walk the long stormy summer. And I think this is a great metaphor because summer is usually seen of the season of life and happiness, right? If you watch a rom-com, it probably takes place in the summer. But here it's seen as this thing that's really dark and stormy. And so even though they've been granted this life that he says should be a blessing, it's not this, perfect gift because they have to live with all of these things. He quotes another author, Willa Cather, by saying, "We possess together the precious, the incommunicable past." So this idea that they are bonded by something that they can't forget as much as they would like to. So that's my quick overview. As you can see, we skipped over a lot. That doesn't mean that you don't need to read it or that it's not important, but I just thought it was important to highlight things that stood out to me. So we took a look at looking at sections, right? What I did, where I went back and I kind of left a comment for myself about the main points of each section. That's something you can do as well. That's a very helpful tool. And we'll talk in the discussion about any other thoughts or questions that you have.